Over to you, David.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to do this. Can we have the slides up on the screen? 1 minute. Yes, there we are. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to set the scene by looking at where we are and looking at a bit at the recent history and also the more remote history as well. So the position at the moment is we're getting over 500,000 sanctions imposed every year on about 400,000 individual claimants. So that means over 40,000 per month. That means that a substantial proportion of all the people who claim universal credit at any time will get sanctioned. We don't have that figure at the moment, but there was a figure that the National Audit Office put out in 2016 that of all the people who'd claimed universal credit over a 5-year period, a quarter had actually been sanctioned. So it won't be as bad as that now, but it's probably something around 10%. So the number of claimants serving a sanction for the most recent figures was 117,000, which is mainly unemployed people, 1 in 13 of unemployed people. The DWP likes to emphasize this figure because it comes out as quite a small number, because obviously if the average length of a sanction is just under 3 months, then it means that each sanction only lasts for a quarter of the year. So you're then going to get a much smaller number who are serving a sanction at any one time. 3 months is a very long time. The reason I think why this is so long is because of these rules about being sanctioned until you comply, and then you have to demonstrate compliance after that before you get your benefit resumed. And that because of administrative snarl-ups and so on, that tends to prolong sanctions. So that the average amount of money lost through a sanction is about £660, which is a very, very large sum for the kind of people who are claiming universal credit. We don't have any serious information on the reasons for sanctions at the moment. We don't have any current data on what the levels of sanctions so-called are. We don't know how the appeal system is working, although we think from older data that less than 5% of universal credit sanctions get overturned through appeal. Can we have the next slide, please? So this diagram runs from April 2000 up to this year, and you can see that there was an enormous surge in sanctions in the period between 2010 and 2015. The current level isn't nearly as high as that, but it is higher than what it was most of the time during the last Labour government, and even in the period immediately before the pandemic. So that's in terms of total numbers of sanctions. If we can have the next slide. I've tried to produce some figures on the proportion of claimants who are sanctioned. This is a little bit speculative. This runs from October 1996, the beginning of job seekers allowance, up to this year. And you can see that at the moment with universal credit, sanctions on people who are in the searching for work category, that's unemployed, that the proportion under sanction is very similar to what it was under most of the last Labour government. Can we have the next slide, please? So the recent picture is one of considerable policy shifts, actually. We had the moratorium April 2020 to May 2021. Now, sanctions were declining quite sharply before COVID. It's not clear why that was, whether it was due to initiative by officials or by ministers. The officials were working under a succession of ministers who had quite a high turnover, and also the ministers tended to be one nation ministers as well, one nation Tories. So it may be that they both wanted to reduce sanctions, and they may also have been rather impressed by the National Audit Office study. In my experience, most civil servants are rather scared of the NAO, and the NAO produced a very negative report about sanctions in November 2016. The changed attitude was reflected in the Sanctions Assurance Framework, which came out in February 2021. This was one that said, before imposing a sanction, the officials should consider the claimant's circumstances and also have a case conference meeting with the manager of the job centre. Now, they're clearly not doing that now, because you wouldn't get through the number of sanctions they're doing now if you were going through that process. The other sign of a changed attitude was the plan that Amber Rudd had for an independent review of sanctions, which was scrapped by Therese Coffey when she came into office. But anyway, the number of sanctions has now returned to a higher level in any period except that coalition drive in 2010 to 15. And also, we're currently seeing a renewed tightening of requirements. So I've listed these on the next slide. We can see the next slide. Sorry, I haven't got to that yet. The point about that this slide is getting across, if you could move on to it. It's not just the numbers of sanctions that count, it's the severity. And in all sorts of ways, the universal credit regime is much more severe than the previous job seekers allowance regime, and certainly than the previous unemployment benefit regime that we had up to 1986. So the maximum length of the sanction is now 6 months. It was only 6 weeks until 1986. Sanctions are served consecutively, not concurrently. Even if people move into a sick status or similar, they still have to serve out their sanction. Hardship payments there's no 80% rate. That was abolished. Hardship payments are discretionary. They are only loans. You can only apply after 7 days compliance. You have to apply monthly. Previously, up to 1986 or up to 1989, actually, there was just a simple reduction of 40%, or in vulnerable cases, such as families with children, a 20% reduction. With no palaver, you automatically got the reduced rate of benefit. And half of sanctioned claimants have to go through this process of applying for a hardship payment, which is very demeaning. We've also got much more stringent requirements about job search. Under the original job seekers allowance, you just had to take 2 steps to look for work in any week. Now you have to spend 35 hours per week. There's major increased requirements on parents, particularly the lone parent obligation introduced between 2008 and 2012. And of course, conditionality has now been introduced for sick and disabled people from 2008. Now, currently, it seems to be rather de-emphasized in terms of numbers of sanctions, but we don't have the data to say. And of course, yesterday's announcement points the other way. Next slide, please. So I've listed here the ways in which conditionality is currently being tightened, and you'll probably be fairly familiar with these things. Next slide, please. So I'd just like to take a look at the longer history of sanctions. Originally, unemployment benefit just had insurance-style conditions, and the word sanctions wasn't used. The word used was disqualification or disentitlement. And there was a recognition that benefits were substantially claimants' own money, because it was three-way, the insurance scheme had three contributors, namely the worker, the employer, and the state. And they all had a stake and were all involved in decision-making, which was independent of ministers until 1999. What's happened is that there's been an increased belief in so-called active labour market policy, which is promoted by supply-side theories of unemployment. In other words, the theory that unemployment is due to the behaviour of unemployed people rather than to changes in the demand for labour. So these theories have become very much more popular since the 1990s. The merging of unemployment insurance, which is an entitlement, and unemployment assistance in the 1995 Act, in my opinion, has also reduced the status of claimants very considerably. And that has helped ministers to build up this false dichotomy between workers who are supposed to be paying the taxes to support the shirkers who are claiming Social Security benefit, whereas the reality is that, as John Hills pointed out in his well-known book, it's the same people at different times. And so what's happened is that sanctions have evolved into a penal system, but without the safeguards that we find in a real penal system. Universal credit is really the fullest expression of these ideas. Next slide, please. It's important to consider what the effects of sanctions are. Most studies show that they do lead people to move faster into jobs, but that the jobs are worse. The study that DWP did recently actually indicated that sanctions meant people had slower moves also into worse jobs. Now, Tom Waters of Institute for Fiscal Studies has argued that that DWP finding is spurious, but I've had a debate with Tom, and I accept his argument may be correct, but it does in fact depend on accepting other unpleasant truths about the sanction system, that disadvantaged claimants are more likely to be sanctioned, and or that sanctions are not effective in promoting job search. There's a specific, very important finding in January this year from the Institute of Fiscal Studies that the lone parent obligation was simply not worth it, because the jobs that lone parents were pushed into were part-time, low-level, didn't offer career advancement and so on. We've also got negative findings about the in-work progression, which is restarting this month. The DWP's own evaluation, published 5 years ago, showed very mediocre results. It did show that people got increased hours and earnings as a result of the attention they were paid in work progression, but it wasn't very much money, so was really not cost effective. And this is all apart from the collateral damage caused by sanctions, which we're going to hear a lot more about today. So my final slide then, please. I'd like to just make these wider points that the previous Labour government did have two very good programmes which received very, very favourable evaluations and were both on a voluntary basis. One was the New Deal for lone parents, because that offered genuine career development, and the Future Jobs Fund, which was aimed at young people, disadvantaged young people. Splendid evaluation results. Sickness and disability are actually a much bigger issue than unemployment, but have received less attention, although the present government is clearly paying more attention to it now. Although it's not a fashionable theory, there still is a lack of labour demand in some areas. The latest Beattie and Fothergill study suggests that there's still about 800,000 hidden unemployed as of 2 years ago. The other thing is the imperviousness of the regime to criticism and suggestions. There's been loads of criticisms and suggestions, but there's been next to no reform of the universal credit sanctions regime of 2012. And my final point, beating people into the ground is not the way to develop a productive labour force. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That really was very, very thought-provoking, and certainly puts us up to date with where we are. We're going to move swiftly on. I'm saving up the Q&A to the end, so if you have any questions, please jot them down and ask them at the end, if that's okay. So Kate is a senior policy researcher for Systems Advice, and Kate, you're going to follow on now.
Thank you. So I've read some research that was published in July called the sanctions file, so I'll just talk you through that. Just for a bit of context, we use DWP data, but also as Citizens Advice, we have access to lots of fantastic data from our advisors. When people come in to see us and ask for help, then we are able to record what they talk to us about, and that means we get both great quantitative and qualitative data. So I'll just talk you through what we're seeing. So that's all right. So on the next slide, please. So as David was saying, also just worth saying, this report looks at sanctions and universal credit specifically. So as David was saying, with universal credit, since the pandemic, sanctions have been increasing, and this graph shows our advice data of the advice that we've been given. So the number of people that we help with sanctions has grown considerably in recent years. This is the proportion of, this graph shows the number of people that we help with sanctions as a proportion of those we help with any universal credit issue. The reason for that being that when we have, we've been seeing obviously an increase in the number of people that we help with universal credit in general, partly through our product claim service growing. And so this gives a useful perspective, because even though the number of people that we've been helping with universal credit has been rising, sanctions has actually been rising as a faster as an issue for us. So you can see that so 4 years ago, basically, the number of people that we helped with sanctions issues was 2.5 times lower than it is now. So it's really a growing issue. So on to the next slide, please. So I just want to talk through a bit about what we found in terms of who's being sanctioned and what differences there are in different groups. So this is DWP data, and this is from February. And so what we found is that young people are more likely to be sanctioned than older people, with 7 times as many UC claimants aged 16 to 24 being sanctioned compared to over 50s. But if you look at specific conditionality regimes, this gap actually grows rather than shrinks. So this graph shows the people from the Searching for Work group, and again, you can see there's a massive disproportionate impact on younger people. 15% of people in this group aged 20 to 24 were sanctioned, compared to just 2.3% of over 60, even though they're all in the same conditionality group. Next slide, please. So looking at gender, this graph shows that people in different conditionality regimes, so people on the left in the Searching for Work group, unsurprisingly most likely to be sanctioned, but massively disproportionately men in that group that are being sanctioned. But even across all 3 groups, we see men being sanctioned more often. In other data, we can see that men, that within the Searching for Work group, men account for 77% of all sanctions within that group, but they only account for 58% of the claimants. So again, disproportionately being sanctioned. We see the same in our own data. So particularly single men with no children, they make up 22% of the people that we have as sanctions, so only 13% of those we have in general. So again, much more likely to be sanctioned than we would expect. So on the next slide, we'll go through some more demographic disparities that we can see. So we did some polling in May of this year, and found that 9% of white people have been sanctioned in the last 6 months, compared to 17% of racially minorities. So they're almost twice as likely to be sanctioned, which is shocking. Disabled people, our data is a bit hard to measure in this respect, but it looks like disabled people are disproportionately likely to come to us to help with sanctions twice. The numbers are a bit difficult to measure because data issues I won't go into, but it may be about 10% more people come to us than we would expect. for sanctions issues?
No, it sounds like why you're not able to.
So DWP does provide data on disabled people and how the sanctions are given out to different groups. What we can do is compare the number of people that come to us about UC versus the number that come to us about sanctions, and it's higher for sanctions, but we also need to see it's complicated, but the number of people that are disabled who claim universal credit, obviously a good proportion of those won't be in conditionality regimes where they can be sanctioned. They might be in those for example. So it becomes a bit complicated to calculate, but eventually I think we would expect to see about 45% of our UC clients would come to, sanctions clients would be disabled, but actually it's more like 55%. But don't quote on those numbers because it's not perfect yet. And then there's also household differences as well. So single people, again, as I said, are much more likely to come to us for help with sanctions. So more specifically, single people with no children make up 48% of our sanctions clients, only 7% of our UC clients. So on the next slide, so we get loads of very quantitative data, but it's also important to understand what this is like for real people. So I just want to kind of go into a bit more about what it's really like to experience this. So what we are hearing from the people that we have is that work coaches often aren't understanding or lenient when they have personal difficulties. So, for example, people are often sanctioned when they miss a work coach meeting due to being unwell or through parent responsibilities or phone or internet issues. We find that even some people are even still at risk of sanctions when they contact their work coach in advance to explain that they have a genuine reason for not being able to meet their conditions. We also find that work coaches are expected to inform clients when they're going to be sanctioned and give them an opportunity to provide evidence as to why they've not met their conditions. But a lot of the people that come to us say that they haven't been given that opportunity, they've unexpectedly been sanctioned. And so we have this kind of guilty until proven innocent approach, which is deeply unfair and causes unnecessary stress for a lot of people that do genuinely have good reasons for their actions. Next slide, please. So not a big surprise to anyone, but sanctions often cause or worsen the financial hardship. Many people are left with little to no income and are forced to turn to food banks and charities to access essentials like food. In our poll, 94% of people who've been sanctioned in the last 6 months told us they had to cut back, borrow money, seek crisis support, and or go without essentials. So that's virtually everyone who's been sanctioned. And among debt clients, so a lot of people come to us to help with debt, and we go through their budgets and see what their incomes and outgoings are. The median income for people who've been sanctioned is £132 lower than it is for people on UC in general. Obviously, people on UC in general, pretty low incomes already. So this loss of income can cause mental or physical health to deteriorate, and when faced with lack of food, heating or electricity, and also inevitably causes additional anxiety over finances. So on the next slide, I just want to talk you through one particular person's situation. So Carolina, obviously not her real name, came to us for help with sanctions. She lives with her 2 daughters in the southeast of England, and she doesn't work and she receives universal credit. Now, one of her children was hospitalised with COVID-19 earlier this year, and so she couldn't attend an appointment with her work coach. She needed to go to the hospital. Carolina let the DWP know 2 days in advance that she wasn't able to attend, but was told that this wasn't an acceptable reason for missing an appointment. As a result, she was sanctioned and her universal credit was stopped for 2 weeks. When she came to see us, our advisors explained to her how to challenge the decision and supported her in doing so. But in the meantime, she was worried about paying her upcoming bills and covering the cost of school uniforms for her daughters. She also needed food bank referral and household support fund referral to help cover the cost of food for her family. On the next slide. So we're doing a larger piece of work and welcome any these are what we'd like us to focus on, but just a few recommendations that came out of this initial piece. The first, I mean, as probably everyone here understands, is that we need better data on this. So we need to understand who is being sanctioned, and in particular things like racial differences and disability, things like that, particularly important. Secondly, we also need to ensure that, as I mentioned, those people that are sanctioned are given adequate opportunity to give evidence as to why they've not met their conditions. So we're asking you to ensure that this happens. And then, of course, in general, we just need a fresh approach. We want to move away from these sanctions that so often penalise people being on a low income. And that's, we'll be working on this, but in the next paper of research, we'll be trying to focus on how we can achieve that. So as I said, in particular, things you'd love to know about them, we can definitely incorporate that into our future research. And that's everything for me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It really was, again, very informative. Let's read the first one, which just sounds good. So, how's the extension of in-work conditionality being communicated to claimants, employers and trade unions? Who wants to take that one?
I can't answer this fully, but I can just give kind of the outcome of our conversations with DWP. One of the things that DWP have told us is that this isn't actually being increased frequency of meetings isn't being communicated in advance to claimants. They're simply being told at their next meeting. And they told us, that means that they don't need to worry, that the reality is people are worrying. So claimants who are currently engaging with work coaches don't have to do anything. That being said, there's not been a huge amount of comms about this. Additionally, one of the things that DWP have told us that we would really like some clarity on is that single parents and parents more generally, individual circumstances will be taken into account when looking at these changes to lead care conditionality. And that includes things like availability of childcare, journey time if you've got to drop your children at school and there's no school transport available, journey time to work and things like that. However, when I asked about guidelines for this and if there was something formal, they don't have anything to provide us with. So again, it's at the discretion of work coaches. Some people are being told that not much is going to change for them because of their individual circumstances, but because there's not kind of some solid guidance on that, we are really concerned. We've also been told, along with some other organisations, that we have a role to play in this comms, but given that there are certain things that we don't understand, that is a little bit concerning. So we would need more clarity from the DWP before we start.
Perhaps it's there's a list of questions that you could come up to put to DWP in terms of what you're unclear about and what you're hearing things from unclear about. I think that might be very helpful. David, did you want to come in here? So the question was about in-work conditionality and how that's being communicated to claimants.
I have nothing to add to that. I don't know. I haven't seen anything come out. I get the daily alerts from DWP, but there's been nothing there.
Okay, and that's something that we can look into as well. So on the select committee, so it's something that we'll ask the questions as well. I can't remember when the ministers do, but we'll make sure that we ask it. And the other bits about data will also be noted